I was 32, living a simple life with my wife Emily, who was 30, and our 4-year-old son. We had never wanted anything lavish, just enough to pay our bills and keep our little family happy. Although both of us worked full-time, we still felt the weight of mortgage payments, student loans, and the everyday costs of caring for a child. Life was stable, if a bit financially tight, and we learned to thrive on the warmth of our small home rather than any bigger ambitions. What I never expected was a single letter, a single business-like message from my parents' lawyer that would send our entire world spinning in a direction we never saw coming. The quiet routine we cherished suddenly felt like it was under siege, and we had no idea that behind it all was a plan that would push our family to its breaking point. From the outside, my parents appear to have it all. They're wealthy in ways I've never fully understood, with multiple properties, a family business that spanned generations, and connections to society's elite. Growing up, I felt like a bystander in their empire, as though I was a prop on display at their dinner parties, rather than a child nurtured for my own gifts and interests. They wanted me to inherit the business, to wear suits, attend power lunches, and hobnob with CEOs. But I was too restless for that life. When I finally walked away, I thought I'd found freedom. I never imagined that what I escaped would come roaring back, determined to claim not just me, but also my wife and child. If I'd known what was waiting, maybe I would have chosen my words more carefully when I slammed the door on their world. The tension with my parents was always present, but simmered below the surface for years. My father, in particular, cherished the idea of passing down his legacy to his oldest son. That was me, except I wanted none of it. I had different dreams that didn't include corporate offices or deals sealed over caviar. When I dared to mention forging my own path, the silence in the house would become deafening. My mother would pretend not to hear me, while my father insisted I was being foolish. I still recall the day I packed my things and left. There was no dramatic showdown in the living room, no accusations hurled like daggers, just a quiet, simmering anger. Yet the real confrontation was only delayed, not avoided. It was destined to happen someday, and neither time nor distance would be enough to keep it at bay. Emily and I chose a modest life. We fell in love with the satisfaction that came from building our future together without outside interference. We took pride in each paycheck we earned, each bill we managed to pay off, and each day we spent raising our son with our own values. When we looked at him, we saw hope. We wanted him to grow up understanding the value of kindness, the importance of hard work, and the beauty of a simple life unburdened by endless ambition. Little did we know, those values were exactly what my parents planned to challenge. And they had weapons of their own: money, connections, and a willingness to manipulate every thread of our existence if it meant controlling the destiny they believed was rightfully theirs. For the first few years after I left, there was minimal contact. My parents were curt in their messages, typically sending a holiday card or a generic birthday gift. I didn't push them to see their grandson, because a genuine interest should come from the heart, not from obligation. They never asked to visit, never offered to babysit, and never showed up unannounced like grandparents who couldn't live without seeing their little one. Their distance was our shield. But that shield shattered the day I opened the envelope with my father's attorney's seal. Inside was an unexpected invitation. "Come discuss your inheritance," it read, as though dangling a golden carrot. Had they been watching us struggle? Were they swooping in to remind me of the price I'd pay for defying them? Emily and I sat at the kitchen table, the letter laid out between us like a ticking time bomb. We had known that, long ago, there was an inheritance attached to my name, a portion of the family fortune set aside for me once I conformed. The conditions were simple on paper: join the family business, adhere to their high society expectations, and essentially become the son my parents wanted. But I had chosen another life. I had told them no. Now, reading the formal words typed by a lawyer, I felt my resentment flare up. We were just starting to see some progress financially, little steps, but steps nonetheless. Yet here they were again, intruding with an offer that sounded suspiciously like a trap. Was I foolish to even consider it? The very next day, as if summoned by the mere thought of them, my parents called. At first, I couldn't process the sound of my father's voice greeting me over the phone, stiff and formal. He said they wanted to meet. They wished to see their grandson for the first time. Something about it felt staged, but curiosity and a sliver of hope pushed me to agree. Perhaps they were willing to drop the old battles for the sake of our child. I should have known better. When Emily and I walked into the upscale restaurant they'd chosen for the meeting, we saw them at a corner table, their eyes heavy with judgment. It was the prelude to a performance we had seen before, but this time they intended to bring an innocent child into their drama. The conversation started in a strained, polite tone. They asked about our jobs, nodded when we mentioned how expensive childcare was, and made subdued remarks about how children need proper guidance. My mother, with a forced smile, spoke about the schools their friends' grandchildren attended delight academies that likely cost more than our annual salaries. As Emily sipped her water, she gripped my hand under the table, silently warning me not to react to their passive jabs. Then came the ambush. My father leaned forward, stating that if we just moved closer to them, enrolled our son in a school they recommended, and considered the family business as a path for me, they'd be thrilled to bestow more opportunities on us than we could ever imagine. It was spelled out clearly. Their involvement in our son's life came with a price tag. I felt my pulse quicken. My voice, wavering with disbelief, asked him directly if this was about me returning to the fold. My father shrugged, only saying that our child deserved the best, and that money and status could secure that. My mother nodded solemnly, as though everything they offered was pure generosity. I glanced at Emily, who was holding her tongue but radiating anger through tense shoulders and clenched fists. Before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. I told them, "You can be part of his life if you give me the inheritance now, with no strings attached." The moment those words hit the air, time seemed to freeze. I could see the shock on their faces, but more than that, I felt a surge of empowerment. For once, I was throwing their tactic back at them. A long silence ensued. My parents' expressions shifted from surprise to a stern disapproval that had once made me cower as a child. They stood abruptly, leaving the table without a single goodbye. Emily and I just stared at each other, grappling with the gravity of what I'd said. I was both exhilarated and terrified. Had I done the right thing by calling them out? There was an unmistakable shift in the air after that meeting. I had crossed a line they'd never expected me to cross. Yet, in doing so, I felt a new sense of dignity. No matter the storm that would follow, I wasn't going to let them treat my family like a commodity. But had I realized just how fierce that storm would be, maybe I would have braced myself harder. In the days that followed, Emily and I kept looking at our phones, waiting for a text or a call. We received only silence. Sometimes that's even more unsettling than an immediate explosion. When I felt close to dropping my guard, the email arrived. It was from my parents, cold, to the point, and steeped in criticism. They admonished me for my ungrateful behavior, and repeated that if I wanted the inheritance, I already knew the conditions. They added that they still wanted a relationship with our son, but claimed I was placing unfair barriers between them and him. The nerve they had to twist the narrative and present themselves as the victims was astounding. I felt my anger rise again, but behind it lurked a nagging doubt. Could we truly keep living with the financial strain while refusing the money they offered? And was I harming my son by shutting his grandparents out of his life? That doubt grew when my brother called, echoing their complaints. He had stayed in the family business and enjoyed all the privileges I'd walked away from. In his view, I was acting like a gold digger, demanding inheritance without respecting the family's conditions. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the money. It was about not letting our child be used as leverage. He was unmoved. It ended in and I hung up in frustration. Late that night, I lay awake, replaying everything. My brother's accusations of greed, my parents' manipulative letter, and the memory of standing in that restaurant after my father stormed out. A small seed of guilt took root, questioning whether I'd lost sight of my original reason for resisting them in the first place. Emily must have sensed my turmoil because she pulled me close and reminded me of all the ways my parents had tried to control us. She listed every manipulative tactic they'd used over the years: threats, false generosity, and emotional blackmail. Hearing it spoken aloud made me realize just how many times they had crossed boundaries. Any pang of guilt I felt began to settle. But as we tried to move on, the situation took another turn. Extended family members started calling and texting, accusing us of being ungrateful and disrespectful. I learned that my parents were telling everyone their own distorted version of events, conveniently leaving out how they conditioned every ounce of supposed generosity. One message stuck with me. A cousin wrote to say she understood my position because she'd experienced similar manipulations at their hands. Her story mirrored ours. She had refused their monetary assistance for college because it came with an entire list of strings, and as a result, she'd been ostracized for years. It was simultaneously comforting and disheartening. Comforting because we weren't alone. Disheartening because this was so obviously my parents' pattern. If they had done it to her, how many others in our family had they quietly controlled or cast aside? And if they had that power, what else might they do to force us back under their thumb? Meanwhile, our bills kept piling up. Emily and I juggled daycare, car repairs, and our mortgage. The temptation grew. Maybe we could accept their money and navigate around their conditions. But that was a fantasy. My parents never gave anything without expecting total compliance. If I accepted their inheritance, it would mean signing away our say in how we raised our own child. I could almost see the future they wanted for him. Strict uniforms, exclusive circles, and an education that preached elitism. Still, a desperate voice in my head whispered about our dwindling finances, urging me to find some middle ground. Yet every memory reminded me of the cost, and I wasn't sure we were ready for that kind of sacrifice, no matter how dire our situation seemed. Within a week, my parents announced through a curt email that they wanted to discuss matters in person yet again. This time, they wanted the meeting at their extravagant mansion, a place I hadn't set foot in for years. Emily and I debated whether to go, but eventually decided we should at least hear them out. So we drove up the winding driveway, past hedges trimmed to perfection, and entered a grand foyer that felt colder than any place I'd ever been. The conversation started just as I feared. They listed all the ways they could enhance our son's life. Private tutors, prestigious social connections, travel opportunities, and a trust fund that would open every door imaginable. But the moment they said, "All we ask is your cooperation," I knew we were on the wrong path again. My father tried to appear magnanimous, saying that because of family ties, he was willing to release a portion of the inheritance to help us right now. But his eyes gleamed with the same determination I remembered from my teenage years, the same "this is my empire and you'll follow my rules" gaze. My mother nodded along, her lips pressed into a stern line. Their plan was cunning: offer relief just significant enough to make us depend on them, yet still hold the lion's share of the fortune hostage until we submitted fully. Did they really think we would fall for it? Or had they convinced themselves that we were that desperate? I thanked them for their supposed generosity, but I asked, "What's the condition?" My father's mouth twitched into a half smile. He explained that we would need to move to a zip code of his choosing, ensuring our son would attend the right schools. We would also be expected to attend family events, presumably so we could maintain appearances among their elite circles. He didn't phrase it as a demand, but the subtext was blindingly clear. At that moment, I felt a fierce swirl of protectiveness for my family. They were talking about my son as if he were a chess piece in a larger game. My father's voice droned on about how these were standard requests for a family of our status. Little did he know, I never wanted that status in the first place. I declined. Politely but firmly, I told them our choices were ours alone. My mother's face hardened, and my father's eyes flashed with anger. Without missing a beat, he said something chilling. "If you insist on keeping your child away from us, there are legal avenues for grandparents to enforce visitation." That was the moment I realized they would stop at nothing. The ride home was silent as Emily clutched my hand. We both felt like an invisible countdown had begun. Threatening to use the legal system against your own child's family is not a normal step. It's the nuclear option, and I had no idea if they were bluffing or genuinely prepared to go to war. Days later, the official paperwork arrived. A threat turned reality. My parents were pursuing legal action to secure grandparents' rights. I sat at our kitchen table with the documents sprawled out, feeling more stunned than anything. Emily, reading over my shoulder, let out a gasp. Our 4-year-old son played quietly in the living room, blissfully unaware of the storm about to descend. It's hard to describe the betrayal. Knowing your own parents are taking you to court to force themselves into your child's life, all under the guise of concern, is a kind of heartbreak and fury wrapped into one. Yet a tiny voice wondered, could they win? Could they truly insert themselves in our home through legal force? We hired a lawyer, draining our savings a little more with every consultation. The lawyer explained that grandparents' rights vary by jurisdiction, and while parents usually have the final say, it wasn't a guaranteed win for us if my parents could convince a judge we were unjustly blocking them. We had to document everything: the years of disinterest, the manipulative emails, the sudden pivot to claiming they cared about their grandson. I felt a weight crushing my chest. The notion that our personal family disagreements might be dissected in front of strangers in a courtroom was nauseating, but we had no choice. If we didn't fight back, we'd effectively be letting them decide how often they could disrupt our lives. News of the lawsuit spread through the family grapevine, and soon I was receiving calls and messages nonstop. Some relatives urged me to settle, claiming that refusing might tear the family apart forever. Others, who had glimpses of my parents' manipulative streak, quietly told me to stay strong. My brother sided firmly with my parents, denouncing me as a self-righteous ingrate. He posted cryptic digs on social media about children who don't respect their elders. I tried to ignore it all. My focus was my wife and my son. We needed to maintain a sense of normalcy at home, even though an undercurrent of tension buzzed around us like static on the radio. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the inside of a courtroom, my parents glaring from across the aisle. Then, out of nowhere, my parents sent an offer to settle out of court. Their lawyer proposed supervised visitation. They'd drop the lawsuit if we agreed to scheduled sessions where they could see their grandson. They also dangled the promise of releasing a fraction of the inheritance as a gesture of goodwill. It was shameless in its transparency. The plan was to gain a foothold in our lives, then presumably reel us in further down the line. Part of me was tempted. Fighting a legal battle drained our finances and threatened to overshadow our lives for months, if not years. Could it be easier to just let them visit under supervision, take the money, and hope we could keep boundaries intact? But every time I entertained that idea, I remembered how they used money to manipulate me all my life. Our lawyer advised us to consider the settlement carefully. A court battle could be risky and expensive. Even if we won, the emotional toll could be devastating. Emily and I wrestled with the implications. Did we want to sign an agreement that effectively legalized their presence in our son's life on their terms? I felt a whirlpool of emotions: fear, anger, despair, and a gnawing sense that we might have no good options. Either we capitulated partly and let them in, or we fought to the bitter end, risking a judge's decision that might give them even more access than the settlement offered. Before we could respond, the situation escalated online. My parents started making cryptic posts about being heartbroken grandparents kept away from a beloved grandson. They used phrases like, "Some children forget where they came from," and "sad day when family turns against you." My brother chimed in, fueling the narrative that I was punishing them out of spite. The public sympathy they garnered was immense. Strangers who had no idea about the deeper story rushed to console them. I felt the sting of it all. Reading comments from people calling me selfish and accusing me of denying a child the love of his grandparents. I had to remind myself that public opinion didn't know the strings attached to that so-called love. Emily tried to shield me from the social media onslaught, encouraging me to block or mute the posts. But glimpses still found their way in. We had family members messaging us, demanding that we unify for the sake of peace. I couldn't reconcile how they expected us to unify under the threat of a lawsuit, as though caving to blackmail was the only route to harmony. Meanwhile, our son started asking questions. He heard snippets of phone calls and saw the worry lines on our faces. Gently, we explained that Grandma and Grandpa wanted to see him, but we were trying to work out some problems with them. His innocence only amplified our determination not to let him become a pawn. In the midst of this chaos, a beacon of hope appeared. Emily's parents. They offered to help with some financial burdens, especially our son's preschool costs, which had been a significant drain. This relief gave us the first real sense of control we'd had in a long while, a reminder that we weren't entirely alone or at the mercy of my parents. That glimpse of generosity from her family contrasted sharply with my parents' manipulative behavior. It underscored a truth we couldn't ignore. Help given freely without conditions is genuine love. Anything else is just a transaction. With our immediate financial crisis somewhat eased, Emily and I had clearer minds to strategize. We revisited the evidence we had mails showing my parents had no interest in our son unless we followed their dictates. Messages from relatives confirming my parents had a history of using money to control. Our lawyer thought we had a strong case to counter any claims that we were unjustly denying them access. But there was a lingering dread. Legal battles are unpredictable. Judges can have biases or interpret the law in unexpected ways. Were we prepared to risk losing total control over how, when, and if my parents saw our son? Time crawled by, each day bringing a new pang of anxiety about the looming court date. Friends and coworkers asked why I seemed distracted and offered half-truths. I wanted to keep this private, but it had spiraled so far beyond anything I could contain. The moment my parents went public with their crusade, I lost any hope of a quiet life. The real blow landed unexpectedly when our lawyer found an old email exchange that changed everything. It revealed, in my parents' own words, that they had explicitly refused to see our son unless I joined the family business. This was gold for our defense. Concrete proof that they had deliberately chosen absence in his life unless we bowed to them. Armed with this bombshell, our lawyer reached out to theirs, pointing out the hypocrisy. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted. My parents' attorney understood their case wasn't as ironclad as they'd portrayed. The veneer of concerned grandparents fell apart in the face of actual documentation that they'd used their grandson as a bargaining chip. I won't forget that phone call from my lawyer. "They want to meet," he said. The significance was immediate. A last-minute negotiation, presumably. Had they realized the lawsuit could backfire if the court saw how manipulative they'd been? Emily and I arrived at the lawyer's office, walking past plush waiting room chairs and oak-paneled walls. My parents were already seated, their faces a mix of tension and residual pride. We sat across a glossy conference table, accompanied by our respective counsels. The atmosphere crackled with unspoken resentment. My father cleared his throat, launching into a rehearsed speech about how he only wanted what was best for his grandson. He offered a new deal. They would drop the lawsuit if we allowed a structured visitation schedule. He also alluded to early inheritance arrangements, should we demonstrate an ongoing willingness to remain in their sphere. I studied my mother's face for any flicker of genuine remorse, but all I saw was steely determination. It was clear they'd rather concede a fraction of their control than risk losing entirely in court. My lawyer presented the damning email chain, letting them know we had no illusions about their motives. A hush filled the room. My parents' lawyer looked visibly uncomfortable. My father's composure wavered, and in that moment he let slip a detail that would reshape everything. The inheritance was not the massive fortune I had grown up believing. The family business was struggling, the finances were precarious, and the sum promised was inflated all these years to maintain an image of power. My head spun. They had used a largely fictitious windfall to manipulate me. The illusions they spun about providing a better future for my child were built on shaky ground. I suddenly saw them in a new light, not as the omnipotent rulers of a vast empire, but as desperate figures clinging to whatever status they had left. Emily's hand tightened on mine beneath the table. A silent question passed between us. If the inheritance was a mirage, was there anything left to fear from these people? Their control was rooted in illusions of wealth, and illusions only hold power if you believe in them. I looked my parents in the eyes, stating calmly that if they truly wanted to be in our son's life, it would have to be without conditions or elaborate deals. No forced relocation. No special school demands. No hidden illusions that money could buy us back. It had to be genuine or not at all. My father's face hardened. He glanced at my mother, and I saw the flicker of panic in their eyes. They realized we were no longer under the spell of their so-called fortune. They either had to concede all terms or risk losing the control they cherished. Silence filled the room for a long moment until my mother uttered a chilly promise that we'd regret this decision. Their lawyer blinked in surprise, probably wishing they could salvage a polite end to the negotiation. Instead, my parents stood and walked out, leaving behind a tension so thick it seemed impossible to breathe. In that abrupt exit, something monumental happened. They had surrendered the facade without forming any compromise. It was a moment of both victory and heartbreak. I realized I had severed ties even deeper than before, but it was better than subjecting my family to their manipulative cycle again. Word spread quickly among our relatives that the settlement discussions had collapsed. People took sides, with many labeling me as the unyielding son who wouldn't make peace. Others, including a few cousins who had previously been too scared to speak, privately thanked me for standing firm. They confided that they too had experienced manipulative offers of money from my parents. The more stories I heard, the more aware I became of how many lives my parents had tried to orchestrate behind a curtain of wealth. It was almost surreal to realize how far-reaching their tactics were. But the true cost was a family fractured across generations. Despite that new perspective, the lawsuit still loomed. My father hadn't formally withdrawn the grandparents' rights petition. We were fully prepared to go to court and present every piece of evidence. Our lawyer felt confident we had a strong position, especially now that we knew their financial empire wasn't as formidable as it seemed. But the possibility of a bitter legal fight still weighed on us. Strangely, as the court date drew closer, my parents' momentum seemed to stall. They stopped posting on social media. My brother went quiet, no longer making scathing remarks. It was the calm before the next storm, or maybe a sign they were reconsidering their approach. Finally, a notice arrived. The lawsuit was being dropped. No explanation, no apology. Just a terse legal document stating that my parents would no longer pursue court-ordered visitation. It felt like being let out of a prison we never belonged in. We breathed in relief, though the emotional scars remained. I wondered what had caused their change of heart. Perhaps their lawyer advised them they'd lose. Perhaps they realized they couldn't sustain the public narrative of loving grandparents once their contradictory emails came to light. Or maybe they simply ran out of energy to keep up the charade of being unstoppable titans. Life after the lawsuit ended was quiet in unexpected ways. The phone no longer buzzed with my parents' demands or my brother's condemnations. Extended family eventually found a new topic to gossip about. Emily and I focused on rebuilding our sense of normalcy, returning to our routine, spending weekends playing in the park with our son, and occasionally going on a small date night when we could afford a sitter. Yet even in that fragile calm, I sensed that my parents were out there, nursing their wounded pride, plotting how they might regain the upper hand. Their silence was more unsettling than their anger, because it left the future hanging in limbo. Despite a swirl of caution in my gut, I had begun to accept that maybe we'd emerged from the worst of it. Our finances were still tight, but Emily's parents helped keep us afloat, and my new job paid better than my last one. Piece by piece, we were piecing our life back together without the overshadowing threat of a legal battle. Then, almost predictably, another letter arrived. This time, it was from my parents' accountant, politely informing me that the inheritance I'd once been promised might be drastically reduced. They were restructuring assets, it said, implying I might not see a dime in the end. I stared at the letter, its sentences carefully worded. A trickle of anger stirred within me, not because of losing out on a mythical sum of money, but because they were still trying to provoke me, still dangling the matter of inheritance like a final jab. Emily shook her head in disbelief, urging me to file it away and move on. In a moment of reflection, I realized something powerful. I no longer cared. The inheritance had lost its hold over me the moment I discovered it was more a tool for control than a genuine financial blessing. I felt free from the illusions they'd spun my entire life. There was, however, a part of me that mourned the relationship we'd never have. In a perfect world, grandparents are a source of unconditional love and guidance. Instead, ours had been more like adversaries. Even so, for the sake of my own mental health and that of my family, I had to let that sadness go. My parents made their choices, and I made mine. I found myself thinking, did they regret what they'd done? Would they ever realize the cost of prioritizing control over genuine connection? The questions lingered, unanswered, yet the path forward was clear. We had to keep living the life we believed in, free from financial shackles. Weeks passed, and our home slowly filled with more laughter again. Our son was thriving, happily unaware of the tumult his grandparents had brought into his world. Sometimes I caught him asking about Grandma and Grandpa, wondering why we didn't visit them. I'd simply say they lived their own lives in a different place, and we'd talk about something happier. That innocence was like a salve to my wounds. As he ran around with toy cars and action figures, I remembered what this struggle had been about all along, giving him a home where love wasn't conditional, and decisions weren't bought with currency. In a final twist of irony, I received a call from one of my parents' old friends, someone from the same social circle they once bragged to about the family business. This friend had heard about the lawsuit drama and wanted to offer support. Carefully, I listened to him talk about how the business was on its last legs, how the lavish image was crumbling. He confided that my parents were too proud to admit the depths of their financial troubles. They'd pinned hopes on me returning, believing a fresh perspective might save the family empire. Hearing that was surreal. All their manipulative efforts to control me were rooted in the fear of losing their standing. It was never about love. That conversation was the final piece of the puzzle. My parents' attempts to buy our compliance with a phantom inheritance made sense in that light. Their illusions of wealth had become a cage they were trapped in, leading them to lash out rather than simply ask for help or accept their reality. Though I felt some pity, I refused to re-enter their cycle of manipulation. In the end, I discovered that true freedom lies in choosing relationships that nurture rather than dominate, and in living by values rather than illusions of grand fortune. My parents may never meet my son on the terms I believe he deserves, but my family no longer lives under the shadow of their demands. If there's one thing our ordeal has taught me, it's that real love, unconditional, unburdened by checks and balances, far outweighs any inheritance or social prestige. And that is a lesson I hope my son, and perhaps even my parents one day, will understand. Money is fleeting, control is toxic, but family rooted in unconditional support can outlast any temporary prosperity. The moment we stop letting fear of financial hardship dictate our choices is the moment we reclaim our power. Sometimes, genuine love is the inheritance we all need, and it's worth more than any bank account or business empire could ever offer.